I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. We're doing something a little bit different. We're going to talk about journalism today. You know, it's one of the things that I do on the site. I analyze the news and tell you what's going on. I have a perfect guest for that today. Not only is he a PhD in economics, but he was also a big-time journalist, editor, columnist for major mainstream media publications. He's a perfect guy to bring this on. Before I get there, a couple of things just happened in the last week or so. Christiane Amanpour, the journalist at CNN, saying that they should lie to the public about Hillary's health problems, just like they lied about FDR's health problems, how he couldn't stand up. That they need to lie and tell the public, not tell the public the truth about somebody's health problems. That's absolutely unbelievable. CNN also edited out a mistake. Hillary Clinton's complaining about Donald Trump calling this a terrorist attack and a bombing, and 40 seconds before that she calls it a bomb, and CNN edited that out. And all these op-ed pieces, LA Times, New York Times, Chris Cuomo saying we've done everything we can for Hillary. The op-ed pieces, USA Today, basically all saying they need to be against Trump. That's not the news, folks. I think it's a form of fraud. And let me tell you why. Because the news, when you're a news organization, you're supposed to be a fair arbiter, objective arbiter of the truth. That's your power. We're going to boil this down and tell you what you need to know. We're going to tell you the truth. But that's not what they're saying. They're stating this publicly. This isn't my interpretation. They are saying they need, it's their duty, or the New York Times op-ed piece, several weeks ago. It's their duty, journalists' duty, to try to stop Trump. It's their duty. That's not their duty. It's absolutely outrageous. And so I want to bring on my next guest. He's a 13 published books. His latest book is this one, The Neoconservative Threat to World Order. And I am bringing on, after many other people have asked him to come on, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Greg.
Everybody knows you were a former Assistant Treasury Secretary, head of economic policy. You invented trickle-down economics, Reaganomics, whatever you want to call it. But you were a big-time editor at the Wall Street Journal. I remember reading you, and I'd read some of the stuff you write. I can't believe they're letting him say that. Of course, now you have, paulcraigroberts.org. But you wrote a piece about the journalism that's going on in America, which is not even journalism, it's spin doctoring. Tell me what your thoughts are about the journalism going on in America, or non-journalism.
Well, Greg, American journalism has never been very independent, especially if it's a matter of war or some sort of crisis as defined by Washington or the establishment. But what happened that really wrecked the journalism we did have was the concentration of the industry during the Clinton regime, when it was permitted for 6 mega companies to acquire ownership of 90% of the American media. So that what had been independent media, or at least could act independently if they were inclined, independent and dispersed media became concentrated in 6 mega corporations. And of course, the value of these media companies are their federal broadcast licenses. So they simply can't go against the government. The New York Times would never again publish the Pentagon Papers. They are 150% behind all the wars. They provide all the propaganda Washington needs. The same with the Washington Post, the same with CNN. They're no longer any independent networks. ABC, CBS, NBC, they're all now cogs and huge conglomerates. The media companies are not run by journalists. They're run by former government officials and corporate advertising executives. They have no interest whatsoever in telling the truth. They exist as propaganda ministries to serve the oligarchic interests that rule America. So they never can go against the military security complex, Wall Street, the big banks. They can't go against agribusiness, the extractive industries. and never against the government's policy. And so we've had a police state put in place. We've had 15 years of wars based on lies, and the media have supported all of this. So essentially, it's not any longer a media. It's a ministry of propaganda that serves the ruling elites. And we shouldn't really be surprised. I'm sure you must be aware, I think it was in 2014, 2 years ago now, that the former editor of Germany's biggest newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitschrift, his name is Udo Ufkadi, he published a book in Germany that instantly became a bestseller. And in the book, he said that as the editor of this big newspaper, he routinely published stories handed to him by the CIA, and that there was not a significant journalist anywhere in Europe that was not on the CIA's payroll. Now, this book has not been translated and published in English. Despite the fact
I hate to laugh, but I get your humor there at not being published in English. Unbelievable. It just matches up with the whole story. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
So what is transpired is that the media is now so propagandistic and so much in serve to 5 or 6 oligarchic interests, so much covering up for government's lies. I mean, these have been extreme lies. You know, the lies that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. This was used to destroy an entire country. It's still destroyed. The lies about Gaddafi, again, Libya was destroyed. The lies about Assad, the whole effort of the United States in Syria is to destroy Syria, to make it as destabilized as Libya and Iraq. All these lies have killed millions of people, displaced them, have sent millions of refugees fleeing into Europe, now overwhelming our so-called European allies. And these are horrendous costs. And the media has never held anybody responsible for that. They don't ever hold Bush or Cheney or Clinton or Obama. It's all just never happened.
Well,
and now we have this latest thing where Washington and its well-financed and well-supported ISIL allies are trying to destabilize Syria, and now Washington has attacked a Syrian army base, a known position. This is the first time that Washington has directly attacked Syrian forces instead of using the jihadists that Washington sent there to do the job for them.
Just so people know, this happened. The Russians are pissed. They killed 62 soldiers, and they called it a mistake. This is the Russians are. This is basically blown the ceasefire over there. I mean, we're teetering on all out war and maybe World War III. I don't mean to be hyping this thing up, but go ahead, please.
Well, what we're talking about before we get into World War III, which is certainly a possibility, what we're talking about is the total irresponsibility of the media, and that it looks irresponsible to former journalists like you and I when you couldn't get away with this. It was too blatant.
Well, one of the things you brought up, that Washington Post came up with this Trump and Putin trying to poison Hillary. This is the Washington Post. These are the people that went after Nixon and Watergate. Excuse me, what? I mean, you wrote about this. Is one of the linchpin things you wrote about the Washington Post. That's outrageous.
Well, the Washington Post printed a story that gave credence to some Nigerian doctor who said that his judgment of Hillary's illness indicated that she was being poisoned by a conspiracy between President Vladimir Putin of Russia and Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. So we have a Putin-Trump conspiracy to poison Hillary. Now, this is in the newspaper, Greg, that has a full-time person dedicated to ridiculing conspiracy theories.
It's off the charts. A month ago, if I made this story up and told you this is what they were going to do, oh, come on, they're not going to do that. I mean, they did it.
But you see,
it's on record.
Well, and it was written for the Post by a woman who normally covers sports for the Post. So what has happened now? Jeff Bozo has reduced his paper below the level of the National Enquirer. You know, the National Enquirer is the paper you could buy at the supermarket checkout stands, and in fact, it may be much better than the Post now. But it used to be a joke because it would have headlines like, "I was abducted by space aliens," and things like that. And so it was always the joke of any comments on the news. So now we have the Washington Post has fallen below this level, and people are not making fun. They're not saying, "Wow, we shouldn't have let Jeff Bozo get Washington Post. It no longer exists. We've now got a second National Enquirer." So you have to say, well, why is all this happening? It's happening because the establishment, which includes both political parties and the private interest groups, you know, we've named them, Wall Street, the banks, military security complex, and so on, they are very much afraid that they may lose control if Trump gets elected, because he's not one of them. He's not bought and paid for like Hillary. You have to remember now that Bill and Hillary Clinton now have a personal fortune of $120 million. And this came from paying them $250,000 to give speeches, big banks, military security complex, the powerful kinds of interest groups who control the laws and the regulations. They own the Clintons. We also see that the Clinton Foundation has $1.6 billion, that is $1,600 million, much of which came from peddling influence to foreigners. So the Clintons present a known, bought and paid for servant of the ruling oligarchy. Trump is independently wealthy. He's his own man. He has his own ideas. And so they say, well, you know, if he gets in there, we might lose control. It's not for sure that they would, but they don't want to take the risk. And so it's all out to smear Trump. And it didn't work. They tried to stop him from getting the Republican nomination with these same smears and media attacks. But people saw through it. It didn't work. It didn't work against Bernie Sanders either.
That's right. So they robbed him. They were able to rob him, though.
They stole it from him.
Yes, it did.
I'm convinced he won the nomination, and they simply stole it away from him. And instead of challenging them, he submitted.
And that's with all the phony superdelegates, and that wasn't good enough. And then, you know, remember the Brooklyn thing where they 80,000 or 90,000 voters there disappeared off the voting rolls? Just one dirty trick after another, and that they had to do that even though they had the superdelegates. It's unbelievable. I mean, what an incredibly weak candidate Hillary Clinton is.
Well, she's strong for the groups that have the power. And that's why they want her there, and that's why they'll do everything they can to put her there. And so,
And then wait, and just so just the Bushes are out now with the stories. They're going to vote for her. So they want to vote for somebody who has a known global charity fraud, who used a private server to cover up the fact that she was taking bribes, her and Bill, and that she basically committed treason by doing this with foreign entities. And they want her. They want her as the president, not Donald Trump, who called people some nasty names.
Well, you see, Greg, what they want is somebody they know is not going to rock the boat. And so they don't care about her crimes. Because that's not important to them. They don't care. They've all done the same things themselves. They just haven't been called on. So they don't care what she is. She could be Satan himself. But they know that they own her, that she is subservient to the ruling oligarchy and will not do anything that the oligarchy doesn't tell her to do. So that's why they want her. And it's no different whether you're in the Republican establishment or the Democratic establishment. They're the same. They have the same interests. They support the same paymasters. They have the same agendas. There's no difference. But Trump, you see, came up from the outside. And so they don't know what he might do. I mean, I think that he would have a hard time staffing a government that would serve him because he doesn't know who those people are. And if he were to be elected, the first thing he would hear is, well, now you got to form a government. You're elected. The government starts. You won't be ready. You got to have a government. Here's a list. Put all these people in. And then they'll end up controlling Trump through the people they staff his government with. We face this huge problem with Reagan. It was a knockdown, drag-out fight to get anybody in the Reagan administration who was on the president's side.
Wow.
So Trump.
That's a big piece of history. I mean, that is folks, please notice that this is a big inside piece of history from Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Listen to what he's saying. That's amazing. I don't mean to, I just want to make sure people listen to this point that you're making right here. Go ahead.
Well, when Reagan appointed me, the Republican establishment put a hold on my appointment.
Oh, yeah. I wonder why.
Well, they didn't want anybody there who was going to do what the president wanted. And, of course, Reagan had been in politics for a while. He had been governor of California. He had something of a team. They weren't sophisticated in terms of Washington. They didn't know Washington. But he at least knew some people that he could count on. But his administration, it was mainly staffed up by the George Herbert Walker Bush and Jim Baker. And they represent the Republican establishment that Reagan had defeated in winning the nomination. And so it was hard for those who were considered to be Reaganites to actually achieve the goals the president wanted, because the establishment didn't want to change anything.
But you did do some good, though. You did do some good.
We were able to stop the stagflation by changing the economic policy, and we were able to end the Cold War.
That's big. That's a couple of big ones.
Big. But, of course, we've lost all that with subsequent administrations. The situation now with the Russians is far worse than it was with the Soviets.
Let's move on to World War III. I mean, this bombing of this Syrian base. They killed, who knows how many if they killed 62, they may have wounded, 162. I mean, who knows? The UN, Samantha Powers is getting grief from the counterpart to the Soviet Union, asking her to invite her to Syria. Putin is, the peace process that he brokered is basically off. Are we headed for World War III? And of course, the press isn't warning anybody about this. Are we headed towards World War III in your estimation?
I think that we're headed toward World War III because of the American neoconservative demand for American world hegemony. They're Their ideology is that history chose the United States to rule the world. And their foreign policy says that the United States must prevent the rise of any country that would have sufficient power to act as a constraint on American unilateralism. So this means any country with an independent foreign policy is unacceptable to Washington. This is the reason they went after Gaddafi. He had an independent foreign policy. It's the reason they went after Saddam Hussein. He had an independent foreign policy. It's the reason they're after Assad in Syria. He has an independent foreign policy. It's the reason they wanted to attack Iran. It has an independent foreign policy. And then the two biggies are Russia and China, because they have emerged as powerful constraints. The United States didn't expect this. The neoconservatives thought it would be a half a century, 50 years, before the Chinese rose to the level that they would be a constraint on the United States, and it happened in about 5 years. And this caught them off guard. And they had Russia under their thumb with the Yeltsin government. It essentially was an American puppet government. The United States essentially was running Russia. And when Yeltsin appointed his protege, Putin, to take over in his place, Washington assumed it would continue because this was Yeltsin's protege. And they got busy, the neocons got busy in the Middle East with all their wars, none of which worked out like they hoped or had promised. We were bogged down in a whole bunch of different countries where we could not prevail militarily, Afghanistan, Iraq. And they weren't paying attention, and Putin brought Russia back. And all of a sudden, he says, the situation in the world is not acceptable to us. You're making too many mistakes. We can't put up with this. And so now they said, oh my gosh, look, now we've got these big constraints. What are we going to do? So they announced a pivot to Asia. We're going to use our fleets to bottle up China. This was actually announced by Hillary herself when she was Secretary of State. And then they said, oh, what we'll do to Russia, we'll overthrow Ukraine, and that'll cause them so much trouble they won't be able to interfere with us. And not only that, we can then misrepresent what's happening in Ukraine and put sanctions on them. We can force our European vassals to put sanctions. Well, all of this has raised tensions dramatically. The tensions now between the United States and Russia are higher than they ever were during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so for this reason, it's very dangerous. And Greg, it's dangerous for another reason. All of my life, every American president worked to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union. You have to remember, Kennedy worked with Khrushchev to defuse the Cuban Missile Crisis. And part of the deal was Kennedy pulled the American missiles out of Turkey. We know that Richard Nixon worked very hard to get SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, to get the anti-ABM treaty. He sent Kissinger to open to China. He was doing everything he could to reduce tensions. Then we had Carter, SALT II. Then we had Reagan in the Cold War. And the minute we got the Clintons in there, we renewed the Cold War. They broke the agreement that the George Herbert Walker Bush administration had given Gorbachev, that if he would agree to the reunification of Germany, the United States would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, Clinton put it right on Russia's borders. Took all of the former Warsaw Pact, put them into NATO, and now we have NATO right on Russia's borders. This is a massive violation of commitments that the United States made. Then we had George W. Bush pull out of the ABM Treaty and arrange for missile bases to be put on Russia's border. Do you see? I mean, the sort of build-up to tensions prior to what's happened now is enormous. And so what the Russians have done, how they have responded to all of this, they've said, look, they don't respond to provocation with provocation. They respond diplomatically. They say, we don't need conflict, we need cooperation. We offer cooperation. Cooperate with us in Syria. Let's get rid of ISIL. You say you're against terrorists. You say you're against ISIL. All right, work with us. We'll deal with it together. But you see, the United States has no interest in getting rid of ISIL because that's the tool it uses to destabilize Syria. And Washington's goal is to destabilize Syria just like it did Iraq and Libya, and as it intends to do to any other country with an independent foreign policy. And so we now have extremely high levels of tension because I think what has happened with this attack on the Syrian troops by the United States, it has made it perfectly clear to the Russian government that diplomacy is useless, that they cannot reach a diplomatic understanding with the United States. And therefore, we have reached the point where force confronts force. And this is the most dangerous time of my life because the Russians have been pretending that there could be a diplomatic resolution of the difficulties. And they keep trying to make agreements with the United States. The United States never keeps them. It has never kept an agreement. And with this latest thing in Syria and the response of that crazy woman that Obama has as the UN ambassador,
Samantha Powers.
This was the most irresponsible action of a public official I've ever seen in my life. And that's what the Russian ambassador to the UN said. He said, in 40 years of diplomacy, I have never seen such high-handedness and demagoguery. And he left the clear impression that he had given up there could be any diplomatic solution and that talking to the United States was simply a waste of time. Well, when the Russians can no longer pretend that there's a role for diplomacy, since our approach is always force, coercion, threats, if there's no diplomatic response, the Russians then say force, coercion. And so you get the two nuclear powers, actually three, because China and Russia apparently have a strategic alliance. So what the fools in Washington have done is to bring the United States into direct confrontation with Russia and China. And the fools in Washington have made it completely clear there's no diplomatic solution, that Russia and China have to surrender and accept American terms, or else all of this coercion and violence continues. So what negotiation means for Washington is you do what we want. That's what it means. It doesn't mean, okay, you've got interest, we've got interest, let's find some deal that we can live with. That's not Washington's position. That's what the Russians have been trying to do. You give a little, we'll give a little, we'll work this out. We don't need conflict. And Washington is saying, we're going to have conflict until you surrender and do what we tell you. Well, this is the position of the Obama administration. This is the position that Samantha Power made perfectly clear. Was it yesterday? The day before? Yesterday? Perfectly clear. She made perfectly clear this. The Russians can no longer pretend that they have a partner that they can make a deal with. All of that kept conflict from rising. Well, now the Russians can't pretend anymore. It's obvious they have a partner. They have no interest on the part of the United States in a diplomatic solution. The United States is determined to prevail and impose its wish, regardless of anybody else's interest.
And meanwhile, the press totally underreporting the seriousness of this. I mean, when somebody of your stature says, this is the most dangerous time in my lifetime, well, you know, nuclear weapons, that's the most dangerous time ever, correct?
People probably don't understand how powerful thermonuclear weapons are. They look at Nagasaki and Hiroshima and say, well, look, those cities are there. They're big, vibrant. Well, the atomic bombs that we dropped on those cities, as destructive as they were, they're like pop guns compared to the weapons today. One SS-18, one Russian SS-18, wipes out 3/4 of the state of New York. Nothing there.
Oh, boy. Oh.
So how many would it take to wipe out the entire East Coast?
10?
4 or 5.
Oh, gosh.
It'd be nothing there.
So my question then is, would they try to do something economically to cut the legs out of the U.S. economy? Before they had to do that, would Russia and China, are they planning on doing something to make war that they can't even finance anything, that the U.S. would get crushed financially? Are they trying to do something to undercut the dollar or destroy the dollar or something like that with the inclusion of the IMF? I don't know. I've heard so many different things. The dollar's going to die on September 30th, and we're going to have a crash in early October. What are your thoughts about being you are a PhD in economics and former Assistant Treasury Secretary? What are your thoughts about the next play, which might be a financial one?
Greg, there probably are some financial things China could do because of its vast dollar holdings. I don't think they are thinking like that. I think that the Russians and the Chinese both don't understand the neoconservative threat. They can't imagine people being that ideological and that stupid. You see, both China and Russia are actually now new countries. They have both emerged out of what we called totalitarianism. It really wasn't. It was a very tough form of government, and it was misguided in many of its approaches. And they have overthrown that themselves, and they've emerged from that in their new countries, and they think the people are reasonable, and that people will make deals to protect their own interests. They don't comprehend how insane the neoconservatives are, or how ideological, or how committed they are to American hegemony over Russia and China. They don't, and so they're puzzled. What's wrong? How come people reject the offer of cooperation? Why are they picking on us? Why do they lie and demonize? And why do they try to put us in some kind of an indefensible position in terms of world opinion? And so I think all that's happening is they're realizing that they have a dangerous foe that's unbalanced, and that they can't reasonably come to an accommodation with. And so I think they now realize that Washington is going to bring them war. Because I don't think either country is going to surrender and just do whatever we want them to do. So they'll be preparing for war. And if they come to the conclusion that they can't wait because Washington is going to strike, because, we've changed our nuclear doctrine. It used to be you use nuclear weapons only in retaliation. There was no first use. But the George Herbert Walker Bush, the George W. Bush regime, the neocons, changed our nuclear doctrine. It's now preemptive first strike. So this then tells both the Russians and the Chinese they could get a preemptive first strike. And then we tell the Russians, well, we're putting the missiles right on your border. You won't have 2 minutes notice. They can't accept that. That's too much risk from a crazy country that won't negotiate with them, that lies and demonizes. So we're headed for war. I think the only thing that can block it would be if one or two of the European governments realize they've got nothing whatsoever to gain from conflict with Russia, and that serves no European purpose, and that NATO is the diplomatic cover for the Americans, and it's NATO that provides the foreign bases, and that the only thing they can do to prevent a nuclear war is to pull out of NATO. So if one or two of these countries were to do that, then the NATO thing would collapse and the threat of war would recede, because the United States then would not be able to put missile bases on Russia's border. The United States would not have the sort of diplomatic cover of Europe for its aggressions. And it's possible something like that could happen. We saw, for example, the British people said we're going to pull out of the EU. Now they're not out. I'm not sure they'll ever get out, because it takes 2 years, and during those 2 years all kinds of things can be arranged and manipulated. But it shows common sense on the part of the British people, and the government itself said it accepted the decision. So if something comparable would happen with NATO, and somebody said, well, look, we're not willing to go up against Russia for you, because we got nothing in this game, no skin in this game. If you want to get in a conflict with Russia, you just leave us out of it. It's not anything we want to be part of. If the Europeans spoke this way, that would cool it down, because the cover's gone, the forward bases are gone. So that, I think, is the remaining hope that Putin has. I think that the Russians and the Chinese will not be quick to go to war. They don't want it. They're not. Neither country has this conquering mentality. They don't want it. China intends to prevail just through its economic relationships.
And speaking of which, just a quick thing on the economy. The economy couldn't be any weaker. I mean, they keep telling us how great it is. The Fed's not going to raise interest rates. They haven't been able to raise interest. They said they're going to raise rates 4 times. They've raised them 0 times. I guess if they want to crash the economy. Your appraisal on the economy, well, you once told me that you were surprised, and coming from a PhD in economics and a former Assistant Treasury Secretary, you said, I'm surprised they kept this going so long. Your appraisal of the economy before we close.
Well, Greg, there's no economy here. It was offshored. So the kind of high productivity, high value added jobs that sustained the middle class and provided ladders for upward mobility, these were sent to China. This is why China developed so quickly. The things that we consume, like Apple computers, they're made in China by Chinese factories. So the manufacturing jobs were moved off, and then we moved off the high-tech professional skill jobs of software engineering, research, design, all these things, and even architectural work, accounting work. So the kinds of jobs college graduates would take, they're diminished. And if you don't have high productivity jobs, then the productivity of the labor force goes down, which everything shows. And they're all worried, oh, the productivity is falling. I don't know why. And it's because they moved the productive jobs offshore. And then we have a financial system that's a house of cards. It's based on creating massive amount of money in order to purchase financial assets. You know, the Fed has purchased bonds until the price is so high, the interest rates are essentially zero. And the Fed has the Japanese central bank, the British central bank, the European central bank doing the same thing. In fact, the European central bank even purchases corporate bonds. So this deprives the population of interest income because the central banks print all the money, buy the bonds, and drive the prices up. So elderly people have no income on their retirement. They have a hard time helping kids, grandkids. We have a situation where half of 25-year-old Americans live at home with their parents because they can't find employment that pays enough to support an independent existence. We have more Americans 24 through 34 years of age living at home with parents than living independently because they can't find jobs that pay enough to support an independent existence. There's no growth in real consumer income. In my opinion, there's no growth in the economy. They produce the image of growth by undercounting inflation so that there's no inflation to deflate the nominal GDP number and the nominal consumer income number because they don't measure inflation. So if you don't deflate the numbers by the real inflation, it looks like you have some growth. But we don't see any signs of it in the workforce. We see that the labor force participation rate has continued to fall during all these years of an alleged recovery. Well, the labor force participation rate never falls during recovery. It rises because people are entering the labor force to take advantage of the strong economy and the jobs. So there isn't any economy. There's a house of cards. It's held together by central bank money creation. The money flows into financial assets. That's what keeps the stock market up. And it flows into bonds, which is why there's essentially zero interest rates, because the price of the bonds are bid so high, there's no interest to be paid.
This is gonna end badly, though. This is gonna end badly, correct? I mean, they're gonna run out of options, are they not?
I just don't see how it can continue. You know, how do you have a consumer market if people's incomes aren't growing? And when they have, people have no discretionary income because after they pay housing and food, whatever they got left goes into bank fees and interest on their credit cards and home mortgages and car payments. And, the economy is so financialized that discretionary income is diverted to the banks in the form of interest payments and fees. So there's nothing to sustain a growth in consumer expenditures. And it's very difficult for people to be able to buy a house when they can't save a down payment or when the housing prices are too high that their income simply doesn't qualify. It used to be you could get a home loan to buy a house that the mortgage service was 1/4 of your monthly income. Then they moved it up to half. So if half of your monthly income is servicing the mortgage, where's your discretionary spending power? How can you go out and be a consumer and drive consumer demand? You can't. And so the economy is essentially a hoax. It looks like it's real because they can keep the stock market up, because all the money the central banks create, it's got nowhere to go. It goes into financial asset prices. It goes into stocks. So we now have a price earnings ratio of 25, whereas it used to be 12.
How long does it take for the House of Cards to go under? When does the House of Cards go under in your estimation? I'm not looking for a date and time, but the House of Cards is going to collapse in your estimation, correct?
I think that what happens is you just get increasing poverty, and therefore people can't buy things, and so stores close, and so you can't even get a job as a retail clerk, and the stuff sold online declines because somebody's got your money. And look, when you've got half of the young generation, 25-year-old Americans, half of them living in their childhood rooms at home with their parents because they haven't enough income from the jobs they can get to support an independent existence, that you've got the end of an economy. I never heard of 34-year-old people living at home with their parents. I mean, so I think it can go on a while, but it's just a slow impoverishment. It's just, there'll come a time when the kids can't get $600 to line up to buy a new iPhone. Mm-hmm. And, there was a lot of fat in the economy. There was savings of the elder generation. There were pensions that people had. You see all these low interest rates threaten the pension funds. They threaten the insurance companies because there's no fixed income for the insurance companies to balance a stock or real estate portfolio with. So a zero interest rate simply destroys the ability of insurance companies, pension funds, to manage their affairs. And so there are all kinds of things can go wrong. And we still don't know what the derivative situation is. There's so many derivatives. I don't think anybody has a very good understanding of what they are, how they could be serviced, how they can be covered. And so I don't know, but it has gone on far longer than I thought it could. And I think the reason is none of the old rules apply. The rule is the central banks are going to keep creating money to keep it all afloat. So maybe they can keep it afloat a long time. But
or maybe it'll blow up one weekend and we'll all be sunk. I don't know.
It could blow up, but you see, we're sunk anyhow because it's a constant impoverishment. You see, it means people are impoverished if they are of working age. They're out of college. They're working age. They have to live at home with their parents. Then the economy's already dead, isn't it?
Yeah.
Half of the new generation, half of the new workforce living with their parents, according to the Federal Reserve.
Dr. Paul Krug, go ahead.
It seems to me that it's going to die slowly, whether it collapses or not. In fact, it is dying. The economy is dying. The infrastructure, just look at the American infrastructure, it's collapsing. They can't keep it up. They can't renew it. They've wasted untold trillions in their gratuitous wars in the Middle East.
Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, here's your latest book right here. It is the Neocon Threat to World Order. Actually, you have 13 books, all winners, on your site. 13 different books. This is the latest book, and you were telling me in the pre-interview that a lot of these books now are global hits. They're being translated into Spanish, into French, into German, into all kinds of different languages, correct?
That's right. Czech, Russian, Korean, Chinese, Turkish. I have a big world audience. It's actually bigger than the American audience because the outside world is not quite as brainwashed as Americans, and they see something's wrong. They're trying to understand it and what the consequences are for them of American high-handedness, American military high-handedness, American economic miscalculation. They know all of this has very bad impact on them, and so they're really trying to see what in the world is going on. How is this going to hurt us? So my foreign audience is much larger even than the U.S. audience.
Well, people love you here in the U.S. I've had several people say, hey, you ought to have Paul Craig Roberts, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts on. And listen, we're going to cut it off. Extensive interview, 50 minutes long. Thank you for taking your time to do this. Your website, paulcraigroberts.org. Your books are in a tab at the top of the website. I will be linking to your website, paulcraigroberts.org. You are a prolific writer. You write all the time. You wrote this thing about the media. Thank you for coming on and tying the global hassle, the global danger we have with America's ignorance of it because of our mainstream media. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
It's always a pleasure, Greg.